Here is the exact moment my whole career turned over. And I want you to start right here, in the most expensive room in the building. On the morning they were certain they had already won. The man who had taken credit for 2 years of my work was standing at the front of the boardroom, clicking through slides I had built, calling the strategy on them his. His name was Chase. He had a good jaw and a better watch, and the specific confidence of a man who has never once been the one holding the whole thing together at midnight. Down one side of the long glass table sat the people who ran my agency, the 2 partners. The VP who 3 weeks earlier had quietly restructured me off this exact account and made Chase the lead. They were relaxed. They had the loose, satisfied posture of people watching a plan go exactly the way they drew it up. And across from them, alone on her side of the table, sat Teresa. Teresa ran marketing for our single biggest client, a national brand whose business kept the lights on in our entire agency. $1.4 million a year, the account that everything else in the building was quietly stacked on top of. If it ever walked, half the company walked with it, and every person at that table knew it, which is exactly why every person at that table was so careful to look like they were the one in charge of it. She had flown in for the annual renewal, the meeting where she signed for another year, and Chase was up there performing my work for her, like a man lip-syncing a song he'd only ever heard on the radio. They had put me in the corner, not at the table. The corner by the credenza, there to support if anyone had a technical question, which is a polite way of saying there to be furniture. Chase landed his big slide. The centerpiece. The strategy I had spent a month building before they took my name off it. He spread his hands like a magician at the end of a trick, and he asked Teresa what she thought. And Teresa did not answer him. She set down her coffee. She let a silence open up in that room, the kind of silence she's very good at. And I watched the partners feel it in their stomachs before their faces understood it. Then she looked past Chase, past the VP, all the way across the room to the corner where they'd parked me. And she said my name, just my name, like a door opening. Chase's hands were still in the air. The VP's easy smile had gone stiff at the edges. And I felt the whole room begin, slowly, to tilt, the way a floor tilts in the half-second before you understand the thing holding it up has been quietly removed. To understand how a single woman setting down a coffee cup could do that, how the quiet one in the corner could hold a table full of her own bosses in the palm of her hand, without ever raising her voice, I have to take you back 2 years. Stay with me. I promise you it pays off, all of it, down to the last dollar of that 1.4 million. My name is Nina. I'm 30 years old, and for most of my career, I have been the engine. The part of the machine that does the work and never gets looked at because the entire point of an engine is that it lives under the hood. Let me explain what I mean, because the whole story lives inside that word. I'm an account strategist at a mid-size agency. In plain terms, when a big company pays us a fortune to fix their marketing, I'm the one who actually figures out how. I'm the one who finds the problem, buried in the data that nobody else noticed. I build the plan. I write the deck everyone else presents. I'm the one awake at midnight when a campaign breaks, and 6 figures of someone else's money is pointing at the wrong page, quietly fixing it, before the client even wakes up to learn it broke. I'm good at it, not in a loud way. In the way where things simply work, afterward, nobody can quite tell you why. Here is the thing about being the engine that no one warns you about. People stop seeing you as a person and start treating you as a utility, reliable, always on, and precisely because you never fail, completely invisible. I was the one who stayed late and caught the error before it became a catastrophe. I was the one who made every person above me look brilliant. In front of clients, I was the only one actually talking to. I told myself I didn't do it for credit. I did it because I cared about the work. And because somewhere underneath all of it, clean, I believed that if the work was just good enough, often enough, the recognition would eventually come and find me on its own. It doesn't. That's the lesson that cost me 2 years of my life. Nobody promotes the engine. They just keep driving the car and complaining about the price of gas. I want to be honest about what that does to a person because it matters for everything that comes after. When you spend years being treated as the back end, the support, the details, you start to believe it. It gets into you. After enough meetings where someone else says your idea in a deeper voice and the room lights up, you start to wonder if maybe the idea only counted because they said it. The erasure doesn't just change how the room sees you. It changes how you see yourself, quietly, a degree at a time, till one day you catch yourself being grateful. Just to be allowed in the corner of the room you used to run. That's where I was. Grateful for the corner. I want you to remember that so you understand what it cost me to finally stand up out of it. Because there was one thing I had, one card, that none of them ever thought to check. And I didn't fully understand I was holding it till the day they tried to take it out of my hands. Let me tell you about Chase, because the whole story turns on the exact shape of him. Chase was an account executive, which at our agency mostly meant that he was charming in rooms. He had the handshake, the lunch reservations nobody else could get, the easy laugh, the right clothes, the gift of remembering a partner's kid's name. What Chase did not have, had never had, was the ability to actually build the thing. He had never written a strategy in his life. He had never sat with a broken campaign at 1 a.m. He had never once been the person the work actually depended on. What Chase had instead was a genius. And I don't use that word lightly, for standing next to good work, at precisely the moment someone important walked by, he had a method, even if he'd never have admitted it was one. He'd let me do the thinking, the building, the late nights. Then, in the meeting, he would present it. And he had this trick of language, small and slippery, that quietly moved the work out of my hands and into his. He'd say, the direction I took. He'd say, what we landed on, with a little weight on the we, that somehow always resolved into him. If a partner praised the plan, Chase accepted it like a compliment he'd earned in a fair fight. And if anyone ever asked a hard question he couldn't answer, which was every genuinely hard question, he had a flawless escape. He'd smile, lean back, and say, let me pull Nina in on the details. Which, in one sentence, turned me from the architect of the entire thing into the assistant who handled the small stuff. For a long time, I let it happen. I told myself credit didn't matter. As long as the work was good, I told myself I was above the politics. I told myself I was the bigger person. And the truth is that all of those noble little sentences were just fear wearing a nicer coat. I was afraid that if I reached for the credit, I'd be called difficult or political or the word they save for women who want what they earned, aggressive. So I stayed quiet. I let Chase be the face. I told myself the work was enough. Lettership adored him. Of course they did. He was charming in exactly the way our agency rewarded. And he made the partners feel good. And he never brought them a problem because he handed all the problems quietly to me. In every way that our company measured a person, Chase was the golden boy, the future, the safe pair of hands. But Chase only ever looked up. That was his flaw, the one that would eventually end him, though it took 2 years to come due. Men like Chase are forever watching the people above them, reading the room at the top of the table. They never once think to look sideways or down at the quiet person actually holding the floor they're standing on. So while Chase was up there collecting credit, I was down here in the corner, quietly collecting something else, something he couldn't charm, couldn't borrow, and could never, ever present. I was collecting the trust of the one person in the whole arrangement whose opinion could not be faked, the client. The client was a woman named Teresa. And she ran marketing for the biggest brand on our entire roster. $1.4 million a year in retainer. I need you to really sit with that number because it isn't just a number, it was the keystone. Pull it out and the arch comes down. Everyone in the building knew that account paid for a meaningful slice of every salary in it, including the partners, which is exactly why everyone was so very careful to look like they were the one managing it. But managing a client and being trusted by one are two completely different things, and only one of them survives a bad day. Theresa was sharp, and she was tired. Tired in the specific way of a senior woman who has spent 20 years being pitched to by smooth agency men. Men exactly like Chase, who present beautifully and then vanish the moment the work gets hard and unglamorous. By the time her brand landed on our roster, she was guarded and fast and quietly testing every single person who came near her account, looking for the one thing she actually needed. Someone real. She found out who was real the night a campaign broke at 11 p.m. 6 figures of media spend. Liv, pointing at a landing page that had silently gone down. The only person who answered the phone that night was me. I was in pajamas. I fixed it in 40 minutes, rerouted the spend, saved the launch, and I never told a soul at the agency because it wasn't a story, it was just a Tuesday. But Theresa remembered. People always remember who actually showed up in the dark. And then there was the moment that truly sealed it. The one that tells you everything about why an org chart could never move her. We made a real mistake once. Our media team overspent a budget by a meaningful amount. The kind of error that makes a client's own boss start asking whether they've hired the wrong agency. The instinct in our building, the Chase instinct, would have been to manage it. Bury it in a slide. Use a lot of soft words like recalibration and optimization, and hope she didn't read closely. I didn't do that. I called her directly. I told her exactly what had happened, that it was on us, what it would cost, and precisely how I was going to fix it and make sure it never happened again. I handed her the truth, clean, so that she could walk into her own boardroom and stand on it in front of her own bosses. She was quiet for a second on the phone. Then she said that in 20 years, I was the first agency person who had ever called to give her bad news, before she had to go find it herself. That was the day the account quietly stopped being the agency's and became mine. Not legally, not on paper, in the only place that actually decides where $1 million goes when the wind changes, in the trust of the person who signs the renewal. If you open the email history on that $1.4 million account, and remember this detail because it is the whole story, you would find 2 years of conversation, hundreds and hundreds of threads, and almost every single message was between Theresa and me. The 7 a.m. panics before her board meetings, the midnight fixes, the hard truths. Chase's name was on the master services agreement. Chase's name was in the org chart, in the slot marked lead. And Chase's name was on precisely none of the messages where the actual relationship got built, one honest answer at a time. That was the real asset, not a contract, not a title. A living thread of trust that leadership assumed they owned. Simply because it happened under their roof, never once understanding that it had never belonged to the roof at all. It belonged to the engine. And then, one Tuesday, they decided the engine could be swapped out for a nicer looking one. They did it on a Tuesday, in 15 minutes, in a small glass room with a very kind voice. The promotion had finally come open. Senior lead on the account I had effectively been running single-handed for 2 years. It was mine in every way except the only one that counts in a company, which is the way someone above you decides to say your name in a closed-door meeting. And I let myself want it. I had earned it so completely, so far past any reasonable doubt, that for once wanting something felt safe. That was my mistake. In that building, wanting something was just telling them where to aim. They gave it to Chase. The VP, his name was Marcus, and he had a way of making bad news sound like a gift he was generously letting you open, called me into the glass room and explained it in that soft, rehearsed language they use when the decision is already made. And all they need from you is to absorb it quietly and not make a scene. They were evolving the structure. Chase had the executive presence the client expects at this level. They valued me enormously, as the backbone of delivery. They needed me to support Chase through the transition. He actually used that word, backbone, to my face, as though being the thing that holds the whole body upright, while someone else's head wears the crown, was the nicest compliment he had in the drawer. Sat there, and I felt the old reflex rise up in my chest like a tide. To nod, to be gracious, to be the reliable one who makes everything smooth, to say, "Of course, happy to help. Whatever the team needs." My whole body knew that script by heart. I had been performing it for years. I didn't perform it. I just said I understood the decision, and I went back to my desk. And I sat down, and I did not cry, because I had finally moved past the part of this where crying was the feeling. I was somewhere colder and clearer now. Then, a week later, came the second meeting. And this one told me everything. For restructuring, roles being consolidated for efficiency. Mine, it turned out, was being narrowed. My client contact streamlined through Chase. My name lifted off the account entirely, so that the org chart would look clean and simple for the big renewal. And buried in the kind words was a sentence about how my role would be reassessed after the transition stabilizes. I had read enough corporate language in my life to translate that one instantly. They were grooming me out. The plan was clean and almost elegant. Make Chase the face, fold the client relationship under him, let the trust transfer onto the golden boy. And once the account was safely his, the engine became one expensive, redundant line item they could quietly cut in the next round. With a nice severance, a reference letter, and a clear conscience, they were going to use me to hand my own client to the man who took my credit. And then they were going to let me go. And here is the assumption the entire plan was built on. The same assumption Chase made. The same one my whole career had been quietly stacked on top of for 2 years. They assumed the relationship was theirs. They assumed trust transfers on an org chart. They assumed you can take a client from the woman who earned her in the dark and hand her to the man with the better watch. And the client will simply follow the new name because the logo on the door never changed. They had never once asked Teresa whether any of that was true. I had. I knew her. And I knew with a certainty that settled into me like something cold and very calm exactly what she would do the first time it actually mattered. So I didn't warn them. I want to be honest about that, because that's the moment my decency and my self-respect, which had walked side by side my whole career, finally turned and went their separate ways. For 2 years, I had protected these people from their own blind spots. I had caught their errors, smoothed their edges, and made them look good to a client. They could not have held for a single quarter without me, protecting them from this mistake, the mistake of throwing away the one person the account was actually built on, was no longer my job. I was simply going to take my hands off the wheel for the first time in 2 years and let them drive. Here is the part nobody upstairs saw coming, because nobody upstairs was ever actually watching the account. They were watching Chase. The transition began, and on the surface, it looked seamless. Chase took over the client relationship. His name went on the emails. He scheduled a lunch with Teresa and came back glowing about how well it went, how they'd really connected, how this was going to be a great partnership. The partners nodded. Everything looked exactly as planned. Underneath the surface, the account began very quietly to bleed. Because the thing about being the engine is that nobody notices the engine until the car starts making a sound. And the car started making a sound almost immediately. A campaign needed a fast decision on a Friday afternoon, the kind I'd have made in 10 minutes. Chase was at a long lunch. The decision didn't get made. The window closed. A small thing. Then, another small thing. 7 a.m. email from Teresa. The kind she used to send me. The kind that needed a real answer before her board meeting at 9, sat in Chase's inbox unanswered until past 11 because Chase did not start his day at 7 a.m. for anyone. Then a number on a report was wrong, and there was no one quietly checking it before it went out. So it went out wrong, and Teresa caught it herself, which is the single most dangerous thing that can happen on an account. The client doing the agency's quality control. I watched all of it from my narrowed little role, my support seat, where almost nothing flowed to me anymore. And I did the hardest thing I have ever done at a desk. Nothing. I want to be very clear about this, because it's the line that keeps this story clean. I never sabotaged a single thing. I never said one word against Chase to the client. I never poisoned anything, never planted anything, never so much as sighed in a meeting. I simply stopped doing the invisible saves, the midnight fixes, the silent catches, the 7 a.m. reassurances, the quiet rerouting of disasters before anyone knew they were disasters. All of that had always been mine, done for free, off the record, for years. Now they belonged to Chase because the org chart said so. I just let them actually be his, and without me underneath it, the account did what anything does when you remove the thing holding it up. It started, slowly, to sink. Then came the moment. Chase showed me exactly who he was. About 2 weeks before the renewal, he appeared at my desk. Not the golden boy Chase from the meetings, a tighter, paler version. Teresa had gone cool on him, he said. She wasn't responding the way she used to. He couldn't read her, and he needed me, he said, to jump back in and help stabilize things before the renewal, to get her comfortable again. He needed the engine. Quietly, off the record, with no credit and no title, and no acknowledgement that 3 weeks earlier he had taken my job. He needed me to come save the account so that he could keep being the man who ran it. And for one long second, the old reflex stood up in me one final time. Help. Be useful. Be the backbone. Make it smooth. I looked at him and I said, very calmly, that I was sure he had it under control, that he was the lead now, and I turned back to my screen. I have never in my life watched a man's face do what Chase's face did in that moment. He had genuinely never once considered the possibility that I would simply decline, that I would let him hold the thing he'd taken, the whole structure he lived inside, the structure where Chase performs and Nina quietly saves him, depended on a version of me that had just, finally, stopped existing. He walked away. And the account kept sinking, and the renewal kept coming. What none of them knew was that I had spent those same 2 weeks doing 3 quiet things of my own. One of them had a deadline. Here is what I did with what I knew, and not one piece of it was loud. Loud was Chase's only instrument. Mine was quieter and far harder to undo. The first thing I have already told you. I stopped being the silent shock absorber. I took my hands off the wheel and let the account go where its own weight carried it, which was down. The second thing was a phone call I made entirely for myself. Months earlier, a former colleague named Priya had left to help run a smaller, hungrier shop across town, and she had been trying to hire me for a year. Every few months she'd check in, half joking, fully serious. I had always said no, because I was loyal, because I believed in the work, because I kept thinking the recognition was just one more good quarter away. I called Priya, and I told her I was finally ready to talk. We had a quiet coffee. I told her what I did, not the title I held, but the work I actually did, the account I actually ran, the trust I actually carried. She didn't blink. She made me an offer the next week, and the offer came with a title that said out loud, in plain English, the thing I had really been for 2 years. a real seat, team of my own, money that matched the work instead of the org chart. And the offer came with a date. They needed an answer by the end of the month because they were building a team and the seat couldn't stay open. The deadline landed, by pure accident, 2 days after the renewal meeting. So I had a clock now, a real one, ticking quietly in my pocket. Of course, I could sign Priya's offer and walk away clean into a life that already understood my worth. But I didn't sign it. Not yet. I folded that letter up and I kept it close, like an umbrella by the door, because some quiet instinct told me there was one more room I needed to be standing in first, with that letter in my bag. The renewal meeting. The one where Teresa would fly in to sign for another year. Or not. The one where Chase, the new lead, would present the strategy. My strategy. The deck I had built before they ever took my name off it. The one the entire agency's survival now silently depended on because that $1.4 million account had quietly gone cold in the 3 weeks since they handed it to a man who couldn't hold it. The third thing I did was the simplest and the calmest calm, and in the end, the heaviest. I did nothing to stop the meeting from happening. I let it come. I let them walk all the way to the edge, carrying my work in the wrong man's hands, certain they had it handled. They had put me on the invite, of course, in the corner. To support. I RSVP'd yes. I knew exactly what was going to happen in that room, and I knew it was not going to make a sound louder than a tired woman setting a coffee cup down on a glass table. The morning of the renewal, you could feel the fear in the building before anyone said a word. The partners were in early. There were closed-door conversations in the glass rooms, the blinds drawn, which only happened when money was on fire somewhere. Because the truth had finally started to reach the top in the way truth always reaches the top, late and incomplete, and only once it's nearly too late to matter. Teresa had gone quiet. The renewal was suddenly, genuinely, not a sure thing claim, and $1.4 million of not a sure thing is the kind of number that pulls partners into the office at 7 a.m., with their stomachs in knots. Chase looked terrible. The watch was still there, the jaw was still there, but the easy confidence had a crack running through it. He had spent 3 weeks unable to read a client he'd never actually known. And now the biggest meeting of his career was an hour away, and he had nothing in his hands but my slides, and a smile that had finally met a situation it couldn't fix. And then, an hour before the meeting, Marcus the VP appeared at my desk. It was the first time. In 3 weeks, anyone upstairs had walked all the way over to my narrowed little corner of the org chart. He crouched down next to my chair, friendly, conspiratorial, like we were old teammates. He said they really wanted me in the room today, that my relationship history with the account could be valuable. That if Teresa seemed to want to engage with me directly, I should feel free to jump in and help land it. What he was asking me to do in his careful way was to come quietly save the meeting, to use the trust I'd built to rescue the account they'd taken from me and handed to Chase, and to do it as support, with no title, no credit, and my role still scheduled for reassessment the second the renewal was safe. They wanted the engine back in the car for exactly 1 drive, just long enough to get them over the hill, and then they'd park it again. I looked up at Marcus and I said calmly that of course I'd be in the room, that I was always happy to support the team. I meant every word of it. I was going to be in the room. I was going to be very supportive. It just wasn't going to mean what he thought it meant. I picked up my bag. The offer letter was inside it, folded soft, and I walked down the hall toward the most expensive room in the building, where 40 minutes from now, a tired woman was going to set down a cup of coffee and change the course of every career at that table, including mine. Now you know everything I knew walking in. Let me take you back into that boardroom. When I walked in, they had already put my chair in the corner. By the credenza. out of the sightline. I sat down in it without a word, the way I had sat down in 100 corners, and I folded my hands over the bag in my lap. And I waited. Theresa came in last. She shook hands with the partners, with Marcus, with Chase. Politely, coolly. The temperature of someone attending a funeral for a stranger. And as she came around the table to her seat, she passed my corner, and she caught my eye for half a second, and she gave me the smallest nod. Nobody else saw it. It wasn't a nod that said anything dramatic. It was just the nod of one real person acknowledging another in a room full of performance. But I felt it land. Something in me went very still and very steady, Chase began. And here is where I have to tell you the truth about the first 10 minutes. Because they were the worst 10 minutes of the whole thing. And the reason this story isn't a fairy tale, for 10 minutes, it looked like he was going to get away with it. Chase was nervous, but he was practiced, and nervous, practiced Chase is still a good performer. He clicked through my slides. He said, the direction I took. He said, what we landed on. He smiled at Theresa, and he made his little jokes. Theresa was polite. She nodded in the right places. She let him talk. And I watched the partners' shoulders slowly come down from around their ears. I watched Marcus start to breathe again. I watched the room begin to believe that maybe the fear had been overblown, that the golden boy was going to charm it home after all, that the account was safe and the structure had worked. And the engine in the corner had been replaceable all along. I felt the old reflex one final, terrible time. Chase hit a slide and got a number wrong. A real error, a meaningful one, kind I would have quietly corrected 100 times before anyone in the room even registered it. My mouth actually opened. 2 years of training nearly made me save him, on instinct, for free, in the most important meeting of both our lives. I closed my mouth, and I let the wrong number sit there in the air, glowing on the screen, true to no one. That was the whole revenge, if you want to know. Not a speech, not a knife. Just finally, after 2 years, the absence of me. And then Chase made the mistake that ended him. Sensing Theresa's coolness, feeling the meeting not quite catch fire, the way his meetings always caught fire, he reached for the one move that had never failed him. He reached for me, to use me, the way he always had, as the safety net under his act. He gestured vaguely toward the corner, and he said lightly, with a little laugh, Nina did some of the back-end support on this, of course, but the strategic direction here was really mine. He said it to make himself look like the leader, to put me in my place in front of the client, to remind the room who was the architect and who was the help. He had no idea he had just struck the match, because Theresa set down her coffee. She let the silence come. That long, deliberate silence she's so good at, the one that made the whole table shift in their expensive chairs. And then she looked away from Chase, entirely looked past him, past Marcus, past the partners, all the way across the room to the corner where they'd parked me, and she spoke. Nina, she said, he's presenting your framework. I'd like to hear the part in the middle from you. The risk you flagged to me back in the spring, the exposure in Q3. Chase, you can sit down. Could have heard a pin drop onto that carpet. From the next floor up. Chase laughed, the reflex laugh, the one that had bailed him out of 1,000 empty moments. We started to say that he could absolutely speak to that he and the team had aligned on the approach. And Theresa, without 1 degree of heat in her voice, without raising it a single notch, said the thing that took the floor out from under the entire room. Chase, she said, in 2 years, you have never once answered an email of mine. I don't actually know you. I flew here because Nina's name was on this work, and I'm now told it isn't anymore. So before I sign anything, I would genuinely like someone at this table to explain to me why the only person at this agency I have ever trusted is sitting in the corner of the room. I have never heard a silence like the one that followed. Not a gasp, quieter than a gasp. It was the specific total silence of powerful people doing math they desperately do not want to do, in real time, in front of the client, whose money is the only reason any of them have the chairs they're sitting in. Chase tried to recover. I'll give him that. He reached one last time for the only tool he had ever owned. He widened the smile, leaned into the charm, and started to say something warm about how the whole team contributed, how titles didn't really matter, how what mattered was the partnership in this room. 2 years ago, 2 days ago, that exact move had worked on every person he'd ever used it on. It didn't work on Teresa, because charm only works on people who haven't already decided what's true. She didn't even let him finish. She just watched him with a kind of patient, bottomless boredom, the look you give a man selling something you already know you'll never buy, and she let him run all the way out of words. And the longer he talked, the worse it got, because every sentence out of his mouth was a sentence that wasn't an answer. And for the first time, the whole room could hear the difference. They'd never been able to hear it before. They'd never had a reason to listen for it. Marcus broke. I watched it happen. He was a smart man in a burning building, and he did the fastest math of his career, and he made his move to save the 1.4 million, the only way he suddenly could. He turned to me, warm now, urgent, generous, the VP version of a man flinging open a door he'd nailed shut himself 3 weeks earlier, and he said that, of course, the agency saw my value, that there had clearly been a miscommunication about the structure, that they would be delighted to have me lead the account directly, effective, immediately, my name right back on it where it belonged, and there it was. The thing I had earned and been denied, offered back to me across a glass table, in a panic, in front of the client, because the only thing in the world that could make them say it out loud was the imminent loss of $1.4 million. 3 weeks ago, that sentence was all I had wanted in the world. The whole room exhaled. The partners nodded along, relief flooding their faces. Problem solved. Give Nina the account back. Fix the chart. Save the keystone. Everybody goes home. Even Teresa waited, watching me, to see what I would do. And that was the moment I reached into my bag. But what I took out was not a phone or a folder or a weapon. It was Priya's offer letter, folded soft from carrying it for 2 weeks, with a title on it that said out loud, in plain English, the thing I had actually been all along, at a shop that had known my worth before this room ever bothered to check it. I set it on the glass table, face up, where the letterhead caught the light, and I told the room, very quietly, that I appreciated the offer, that I genuinely did, but that I had signed elsewhere that morning, that my last day was already on the calendar, and that Teresa, of course, should make whatever decision was right for her brand, with no pressure from me at all. I did not have to say the rest. Every person at that table could already do the math, and for once in my life, I sat back and let them do it without my help. Teresa picked up the offer letter. She read the name on the letterhead, and the smallest smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first warm thing that had happened on her face since she walked in. She set it back down, turned to the partners, and said she would be making her decision about the renewal by the end of the week. She did not need to say the rest either. I stood up, and as I gathered my bag, Marcus rose with me and walked me to the door, close. His voice dropped low and no longer warm at all. He reminded me quietly that my contract had a non-solicitation clause, that if I tried to take the client with me, there would be consequences. It was the last card he had, and he played it the way frightened men play their last card. As a threat dressed up as a reminder, I stopped at the door. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him the truth, which was the only weapon I had ever needed in that building. I had not solicited anyone. I had never said one word to Teresa about leaving. He could check. And given how that account's email history read, I rather thought, he should. Whatever Teresa decided, she would decide entirely on her own. The way she had decided everything about that account for 2 years, based on the one thing his org chart had never been able to give her, and never would. And then I said the only slightly unkind thing I said, all day, gently, almost as a courtesy. You spent 3 weeks teaching the most important client in this building that the person she trusts is disposable, I said. I'd worry less about the clause, Marcus, and more about what you just taught her. Same. I picked up my coat, and I walked out of the most expensive room in the building, past the corner where they'd parked me, and I did not look back. I had been looking back my whole career. This time, I just left. Here is how it landed, in case you need it to land clean. It landed exactly the way 2 years of midnight emails always said it would. Teresa did not renew. By the end of that week, the $1.4 million account, the keystone, the thing the whole arch was built on, quietly came apart from the agency. And within a month, it followed the only person in it she had ever actually trusted, to my new shop, where I was the lead. Out loud, with my name on the work, a team of my own, and a client who already knew my number by heart. I want to be honest about something because it matters. I never poached her. I never asked. I never sent a single message. I simply stopped standing under a structure that had decided I was disposable. And the weight it had been quietly resting on me went where weight goes when you remove the thing holding it up. It fell, and then it rolled, on its own, downhill, to the place it had really belonged all along. The agency did not survive losing it cleanly. Keystone is a keystone. There were cuts that fall, layoffs in the spring, a smaller office by summer. I won't pretend I felt nothing about that, because there were good people in that building who never did me any harm. But I have made my peace with a simple truth. I did not knock the arch down. I just stopped being the stone they'd hidden inside it, holding it up for free, and I let the structure stand or fall on what they'd actually built. It turned out they hadn't built much. That was never mine to fix. Chase did not survive losing the agency's biggest client 3 weeks after being handed it. You can only stand next to the fire for so long before someone finally asks you to light one yourself, and the day they asked. His hands were empty, the way they had always been empty. Last I heard, he'd moved to a different city and a different agency to begin the whole performance again in front of people who hadn't watched it collapse in real time. Marcus sent me a long message a few weeks later, warm again, full of words like miscommunication and we should have recognized you sooner, any chance we could reconnect. I read it the way you read a weather report for a city you used to live in and will never move back to. I answered it, because I'm not cruel. I just didn't go back. And me, I run the account now, the real way, out loud. In rooms where my name is on the door I walk through, not on a slide some other man is presenting. I make more money than I ever did being the backbone. And the strangest thing is, I sleep better, even though I work just as hard, because there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes only from doing the work and watching someone else take the bow for it. And that specific bone-deep tiredness is simply gone now. I didn't know how heavy it was until I set it down. I think about that boardroom sometimes. Chase at the front, with his hands spread wide, calling my work his. The partners nodding along. Marcus relaxed in his chair. Me in the corner, they were all so certain I belonged in. They kept calling me the backbone. They said it like a compliment. But I understand now what they really meant by it. Underneath, they meant it as a way to keep me bent. The backbone holds everything up and never gets to stand up straight. That was the whole arrangement, and I'd lived inside it for 2 years, without ever once saying the word out loud. They never stopped to think about what happens to a body the day the backbone decides it's done, the day it straightens up and gathers its things and walks itself out the door. They found out $1.4 million worth. of finding out if you'd have set the offer letter on the table too, or if you think she should have taken the lead back and stayed. Tell me in the comments. And if you've ever been the backbone, the engine, everyone leans on and forgets to credit, you already know exactly how this feels. Subscribe for more stories about the people everyone underestimated, right up until the day they stopped holding it all up for free.